a man they called crazy, a shack made of ice and salvaged wood, and $270 million buried in frozen ground that would silence every person who ever laughed at him. Before you explore, we dive into the story. Make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing, howling and clawing at everything in its path. In the small Montana town of Coldwater Ridge, population 347, people huddled in their warm homes, fires crackling, while outside the temperature dropped to 15 below zero. But 5 miles up the mountain, past where the paved road ended and the wilderness began, a single plume of smoke rose from what looked like a pile of junk, barely held together by hope and desperation. Marcus Webb sat inside what the townspeople mockingly called the ice shack, though he preferred to think of it as home. The structure was a patchwork of weathered plywood, corrugated metal, and yes, blocks of ice he'd cut from the frozen creek and stacked as insulation against the outer walls. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't conventional, but it was his, and it kept him alive through winters that would kill a lesser man. He was 42 years old, though the mountain had aged him in ways that made him look closer to 60. His beard was thick and streaked with gray, his hands calloused and scarred from years of survival. His eyes, though, still held something fierce, something unbroken. He stirred the pot of rabbit stew hanging over his small wood stove, the only source of heat in the 12 by 16-foot space he called home. The townspeople loved to talk about him. Oh, how they loved to talk. At Riley's general store, they'd whisper and point when he came down the mountain once a month for supplies. At the Silver Pine Diner, they'd nudge each other and snicker when he walked past the windows. The children would dare each other to get close to the crazy mountain man, then scatter like birds when he looked their way. Marcus heard it all. The mountain man, the hermit, the lunatic living in an igloo, the fool who'd lost his mind and his future. He heard every cruel nickname, every dismissive laugh, every pitying shake of the head, and he felt each one like a knife between the ribs, though he'd never let them see it hurt. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was why he was up there. Why a man with a master's degree in geology and a promising career would abandon everything to live like a relic from another century. They didn't know because they'd never asked. They'd just assumed he was crazy, and that was easier than the truth. 3 years ago, Marcus had been someone else entirely. He'd worked for Bridgemont Mining Corporation, one of the largest mining operations in the Northwest. He wore pressed shirts and steel-toed boots that cost more than some people's car payments. He had an apartment in Billings with running water and central heating, and a coffee maker that could brew 16 different types of espresso. He'd been good at his job, brilliant even. His specialty was geological surveying, finding mineral deposits, mapping underground formations, predicting where the valuable ore would be. He could read the earth like other people read books, seeing patterns and possibilities invisible to untrained eyes. That's what had led him to Coldwater Ridge. In the first place, Bridgemont had purchased mineral rights to 5,000 acres surrounding the tiny town, convinced there were significant copper deposits in the mountains. Marcus had been sent to survey the land, to confirm the company's suspicions, to greenlight a mining operation that would have brought jobs and money to the struggling community. He'd spent 6 months studying those mountains, drilling core samples, mapping fault lines, analyzing rock compositions, and he'd found something, all right, just not what Bridgemont expected. The copper deposits were there, but they were minimal, barely worth the cost of extraction. What Marcus found instead was something that would have destroyed Coldwater Ridge completely. The entire mountain was riddled with abandoned mine shafts from the 1800s, unstable caverns, and a massive underground water system that supplied the town's wells and the creek that fed into the valley below. If Bridgemont proceeded with their planned open-pit mining operation, using the explosives and heavy machinery they'd already ordered, the mountain would collapse. The water system would be contaminated or destroyed. The town would quite literally crumble, buildings sinking into sudden sinkholes, water sources drying up or turning toxic. Marcus had written his report with shaking hands, documenting everything. He'd included photographs, geological surveys, computer models showing the catastrophic consequences. He'd labeled it urgent and marked it critical and sent it up the chain of command, confident that once his superiors saw the evidence, they'd cancel the project immediately. That confidence had been naive. 2 weeks later, his supervisor called him into a conference room. There were 3 other men there, executives Marcus had never met, wearing expensive suits and expressions carved from stone. They told him his report was incomplete, that he needed to revise his findings, that the company had invested $17 million in this project, and shareholders were expecting returns. They suggested he'd made errors in his analysis, mistakes that a more thorough review would certainly correct. Marcus had stood his ground. He'd explained again, slower this time, what would happen if they proceeded. He'd pulled out his documentation, his proof, his evidence. He'd appealed to their humanity, their ethics, their basic sense of right and wrong. They'd offered him a promotion, a significant raise, a corner office in the headquarters building. When he refused, they'd offered him severance, 6 months, salary, and a confidentiality agreement. When he refused that, they'd fired him, effective immediately. Security had escorted him from the building with his personal items in a cardboard box, his access badge confiscated, his career in ruins. But Marcus couldn't let it go. He'd contacted environmental agencies, tried to blow the whistle, attempted to warn the town. The agencies said they'd look into it. But Bridgemont had lawyers and lobbyists and politicians in their pockets. His warnings to the town council fell on deaf ears because Bridgemont had promised jobs, promised prosperity, promised to save their dying community. No one wanted to hear that their salvation was actually their destruction. No one wanted to believe that the big corporation with the glossy brochures and the impressive presentations was lying to them. And certainly no one wanted to trust the disgruntled ex-employee who'd been fired for incompetence, at least according to Bridgemont's carefully crafted narrative. Marcus had felt himself breaking under the weight of it all. He'd spent everything he had, burned every bridge, sacrificed his entire career, and no one would listen. His warnings were dismissed. His evidence was ignored. His reputation was destroyed. So he'd made a decision that everyone thought was insane. If no one would listen to him, he'd make them listen another way. He'd bought the cheapest piece of land he could find on the mountain, a worthless plot that Bridgemont didn't want because it wasn't in their mining zone. He'd built his shack right there, a permanent protest, a human barrier between the mining company and their destructive plans. He'd thought his presence would draw attention, that reporters would come, that someone would finally investigate. He'd thought wrong. Instead, he became the crazy mountain man, the local joke, the cautionary tale mothers told their children about what happens when you throw your life away. Bridgemont had eventually pulled out, but not because of Marcus. The copper prices had dropped, making the project less profitable. They'd quietly sold their mineral rights to a smaller company and moved on to more lucrative ventures. The town had mourned the loss of promised jobs and prosperity, and they'd blamed Marcus for driving away their opportunity. Even though he'd actually saved them from disaster, they'd never know they'd avoided. And Marcus had stayed, partly from stubbornness, partly from exhaustion, partly because he had nowhere else to go. His savings were gone. His career was destroyed. His name was mud in the industry. The shack on the mountain had become less of a protest and more of a prison, but it was all he had. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of isolation, of survival, of teaching himself to trap and hunt and fish. 3 years of townspeople treating him like a curiosity or a threat, never as a human being. 3 years of wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The rabbit stew bubbled, and Marcus ladled some into a chipped ceramic bowl. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth, listening to the wind batter his walls. The ice blocks he'd stacked had been genius, actually. They provided better insulation than people realized, and as long as the temperature stayed below freezing, they'd last all winter. In spring, he'd replace them with packed earth and sod. He'd read somewhere that the Inuit built homes from ice that could be warmer inside than you'd believe. People mocked what they didn't understand. That seemed to be humanity's default setting. After dinner, Marcus banked the fire in his wood stove and climbed into his sleeping bag, layered with wool blankets and a bear hide he'd traded for at a rendezvous with other mountain folk, people who didn't judge, who understood that sometimes a man had reasons for choosing solitude. Outside, the storm intensified. This wasn't unusual for January in Montana. What was unusual was the sound. Around midnight, Marcus woke to a groaning noise, deep and resonant, like the mountain itself was shifting. He sat up, breath misting in the cold air. The sound came again, not from outside, but from below. From beneath the floorboards of his shack, he grabbed his flashlight and examined the floor. He'd built it himself, rough planks laid over support beams, with a crawl space underneath for air circulation and to prevent moisture buildup. He'd been under there a dozen times, checking for problems, making repairs. It was just frozen earth and rock underneath. Nothing unusual. The groaning came again, longer this time, accompanied by a subtle vibration he could feel through his sleeping bag. Marcus pulled on his boots and coat, then moved the few pieces of furniture he owned. His small table, a storage trunk, a wooden chair. He pried up one of the floorboards, expecting to see what he always saw. Darkness, frozen ground, maybe some ice crystals catching his flashlight beam. Instead, he saw a crack, a thin line in the earth below, running lengthwise beneath his shack. It hadn't been there before. He was certain of it. He spent the next hour examining it, moving more floorboards, following the crack. It ran almost the entire length of his shack, about 10 feet long and maybe an inch wide. As he studied it, another groan echoed from below, and the crack widened slightly, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to make his geologist's mind race. This wasn't normal ground settling. This wasn't frost heave or seasonal shifting. This was something else, something deeper. The earth underneath his shack was hollow. Marcus had surveyed this entire mountain. He knew every geological formation, every rock layer, every underground feature. There wasn't supposed to be a cavity here. This area was solid granite, ancient bedrock that had been here for millions of years. Hollow spaces didn't just appear in granite, yet here it was. Impossible and undeniable. He pressed his ear to the floor, listening. The wind outside made it difficult, but between gusts he could hear something, a hollow echo, like sound bouncing in an empty space. And something else, fainter, almost like dripping water, except water should have been frozen solid at these temperatures. The storm raged for 3 more days. Marcus spent that time obsessing over the crack, measuring it, photographing it with his old camera, taking notes in his weathered journal. The crack was growing, slowly but steadily, widening by millimeters each day. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The sun emerged pale and weak, making the snow-covered mountain shimmer like it was made of diamonds. Marcus pulled on his warmest gear and trudged down to town. He needed supplies, but more than that, he needed to look at the old mining records at the town's historical society. The walk took him 2 hours through waist-deep snow. By the time he reached Coldwater Ridge, his beard was crusted with ice, and his fingers were numb despite his gloves. He headed straight for the Historical Society, a converted church building that housed the town's archives and museum. The woman at the desk, Patricia, looked up as he entered, and her welcoming expression immediately soured. "Marcus," she said coolly, "we close in an hour. I need to look at mining records," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "From the 1800s. Patricia's eyebrows rose. "Those records are for researchers and historians. You need to submit a formal request." "I am a researcher," Marcus replied. "I have a master's degree in geology." "Had," Patricia corrected. "You had a career. Now, you're just the man who lives in an ice shack." She said it without malice, just stating what she believed to be fact, which somehow made it worse. Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but pushed it down. "Please, Patricia, it's important. I found something under my property, and I need to check the old mining maps." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, but you touch anything that's not a record book, and you're out. And you're still done in an hour." The mining records from the 1800s were extensive. Coldwater Ridge had been a boom town once, back when people believed these mountains were full of gold and silver. Dozens of mining operations had sprung up, most failing within a year or two, some lasting longer. The records were a mess of handwritten claims, maps drawn by optimistic prospectors, and official surveys that were more hope than science. Marcus searched through them systematically, looking for any operation that had worked near his property. Most of the claims were miles away, closer to where the town now stood. But then, 40 minutes into his search, he found something. A claim filed in 1876 by a prospector named Wilhelm Schneider. The map was crude, but the landmarks were clear enough. A distinctive rock formation, a bend in the creek, a lightning-struck pine that had probably been gone for a century. All of them matched the area where Marcus's shack now stood. The claim had been abandoned in 1878 after 2 years of operation. No reason given, which was unusual. Most abandoned claims at least noted whether they'd found nothing, or run out of money, or hit some other obstacle. This one just stopped, as if someone had walked away mid-sentence. Marcus photographed the document with his phone, which he kept powered off most of the time to save battery. He was about to close the record book when he noticed something else. A small notation in the margin, written in different ink, added later. It said simply, "Sealed by order of territorial marshal. Do not enter." His heart began to pound. Sealed mines weren't uncommon in the old days. If a mine was particularly dangerous, or if something had happened inside, authorities would sometimes order them sealed, filled with rock and dirt, to prevent accidents. But those orders were usually accompanied by reports, explanations, some kind of documentation about why. This one had nothing, just those 6 words, written like a warning. "Time's up," Patricia called from the front desk. Marcus carefully returned the records to their place and headed for the door. As he passed Patricia, he paused. "Do you remember any stories about the old Schneider mine?" "From the 1870s, Patricia frowned. "Schneider? That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it." "Why?" "Just curious," Marcus said. "Thanks for letting me look." Outside, the sun was already setting, painting the snow orange and purple. Marcus started the long trek back up the mountain, his mind racing. If there was an old sealed mine under his property, that would explain the hollow space, the groaning sounds, the crack in the earth. The mine shaft or tunnel must have survived somehow, and now, after more than 140 years, something was causing it to shift. But that raised more questions than it answered. Why hadn't he found evidence of the mine when he'd surveyed the area? Why was there no visible entrance? How had it remained sealed and stable for so long, only to become unstable now? And most troubling of all, what had happened in 1878 that caused the territorial marshal to order it sealed? By the time Marcus reached his shack, it was full dark, and the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. He was exhausted, hungry, and half frozen. He built up his fire, heated some water for tea, and sat down to study the photograph of the old mining claim on his phone screen. That's when he heard it again, the groaning from below, but this time it was different, louder, more urgent. And then, with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot, one of his floorboards split down the middle. Marcus jumped back as the board splintered and sagged. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it down through the gap. The crack in the earth had widened to nearly 6 inches, and beyond it, in the beam of his flashlight, he could see something that made his breath catch. Darkness. Not the darkness of frozen earth, but the darkness of empty space. Deep, hollow, descending into nothing. And from that darkness, rising up through the crack, came a smell. Not decay, not mold, but something metallic and cold. Like old coins. Like buried treasure. Like secrets the mountain had kept for more than a century. Marcus knelt at the edge of the broken floor, his heart hammering, his hands shaking, and, for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than resignation, or anger, or bitter acceptance. He felt the thrill of discovery, the electric charge of standing at the edge of the unknown. Whatever was down there, whatever lay beneath his ice shack, it had been hidden for more than 140 years. And now, because of a winter storm and the shifting of ancient rock and pure dumb luck, it was revealing itself. The man they'd mocked, the lunatic they'd dismissed, the fool they'd pitied, had quite literally been living on top of something extraordinary. He didn't know what yet, but he was going to find out. Outside, the wind picked up again, beginning another storm. But inside the ice shack, Marcus barely noticed. He was already pulling up more floorboards, widening the gap, preparing to descend into the mountain's secret heart. The townspeople thought he'd lost everything. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you throw away success and stability. They had no idea that he was about to prove them all wrong in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Marcus spent the next hour pulling up every floorboard he could safely remove. The gap in the earth below had widened to nearly a foot across, and when he shined his flashlight down, the beam seemed to be swallowed by an impossibly deep darkness. The smell grew stronger, that metallic, ancient scent that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd need equipment, rope, at minimum. Maybe climbing gear if he could improvise it. He had paracord, lots of it, salvaged from various sources and stored in his supply trunk. He had carabiners from his old rock climbing days, back when he'd had friends and weekends and a life that included recreation instead of just survival. He had a harness too, though it was old, and he'd need to inspect it carefully before trusting his life to it. But first, he needed to understand what he was looking at. He lay flat on the remaining floorboards, positioning himself as close to the opening as he dared, and angled his flashlight downward at different angles, trying to map the space below. It wasn't just a crack in the earth. It was a chamber, a cavity carved into the granite. The walls looked smooth, too smooth to be natural. This was definitely the old mine, or part of it. The beam of his flashlight caught something else, about 15 feet down, a reflection. Something down there was catching and throwing back the light. Marcus's geological training kicked in automatically. He studied the rock formations visible in the flashlight beam, noting the striations, the color variations, the way the stone had fractured. This granite was old, Precambrian probably, some of the oldest rock in North America. The mine shaft had been cut through it with considerable skill. The walls showed chisel marks, the systematic work of someone who knew what they were doing. But why dig here? This area had never been known for gold or silver. Copper, yes, but copper deposits were usually closer to the surface, not buried this deep in granite. What had Wilhelm Schneider been looking for in 1876? The wind outside reached a howling crescendo, and Marcus's entire shack shuddered. One of his ice blocks shifted with an audible crack. He was running out of time. The storm was getting worse, and if his shack sustained serious damage, he'd be in real trouble. But the thought of leaving that opening unexplored, of not knowing what lay beneath, was unbearable. He made a decision that was probably stupid, definitely reckless, but absolutely necessary. He was going down there. Tonight. Now. Marcus worked quickly, securing his paracord to the support beams that held up his shack's roof. He tested the knots 3 times, pulling with all his weight. They held. He threaded the rope through his old climbing harness, checked every strap and buckle twice, then attached his flashlight to a carabiner on his chest, so it would shine wherever he looked. He lowered a weighted line first, a rock tied to string, to measure the depth. The rock hit something solid, at 18 feet. Not too bad. He'd climbed bigger cliffs, descended deeper caves, back when he'd been younger and more confident, and hadn't yet learned how badly the world could break you. At the edge of the opening, Marcus paused. This was insane. He was alone on a mountain, in a storm, about to descend into a 140-year-old mine shaft that had been sealed for reasons unknown. If something went wrong, if the rope failed or the walls collapsed or he injured himself, no one would find him. The townspeople would eventually notice he hadn't come down for supplies, and they'd probably just assume he'd finally frozen to death or wandered off into the wilderness to die alone. He thought about turning back, about waiting for daylight, about hiking down to town, and maybe, just maybe, trying to convince someone to help him explore this properly. But he already knew how that would go. They'd think he was crazy, trying to con them, or looking for attention. The man who lived in an ice shack, claiming he'd found something valuable under his floor, they'd laugh him right out of town. Marcus clipped into the rope, said a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, and lowered himself into the darkness. The descent was slow and careful. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to angle himself to fit through. The temperature dropped immediately as he went down, the air growing colder and drier. His flashlight beam swept across the stone walls, revealing more chisel marks, some kind of systematic pattern he didn't immediately understand. At 10 feet, the shaft widened slightly. At 15 feet, it opened considerably, and at 18 feet, his boots touched solid ground. Marcus unclipped from the rope, but left it hanging, his lifeline back to the surface. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting his flashlight illuminate the space around him. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. He was standing in a chamber, roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across. The ceiling was about 12 feet high, supported by timber beams that looked impossibly old, but somehow still solid. The walls were granite, carved smooth, with niches cut into them at regular intervals, and in those niches, on crude shelves made from planks, were boxes, dozens of them, wooden crates of various sizes, some small enough to carry with one hand, others large enough to hold a grown man. The reflection he'd seen from above came from metal banding on the crates, iron or steel straps, holding them closed. Some of the boxes had broken open over the years, their contents spilling onto the chamber floor. Marcus's flashlight caught glimmers and gleams, things that didn't belong in an abandoned mine. He approached the nearest broken crate carefully, watching where he stepped. The floor was stone but uneven, with puddles of water that had somehow remained liquid despite the cold. Underground spring, probably, or water seeping through cracks from the snowmelt layers above. The broken crate had split along one side, and Marcus could see inside. His hands trembled as he reached in and pulled out the first object. A bar of metal, roughly rectangular, about the size of a brick, but much heavier. He turned it over in his hands, brushing away decades of dust and grime. In the flashlight beam, the metal gleamed with an unmistakable yellow luster, gold. It was a gold bar, stamped with marks he didn't immediately recognize. Not modern mint marks, but something older. He could make out numbers, 1874, and a symbol, an eagle with spread wings. Marcus set the bar down carefully and reached into the crate again. More bars, at least 20 of them, all gold. He moved to another broken crate. This one held smaller items wrapped in rotted cloth. He unwrapped one carefully and nearly dropped it in shock. It was a coin, but not like any coin he'd ever seen in a museum. Gold, large, with a woman's profile on one side and a flying eagle on the reverse. The date read 1877. His heart was hammering now, adrenaline flooding his system. He moved faster, checking more crates, more niches. One held silver bars, tarnished black, but unmistakably valuable. Another held what looked like jewelry, ornate pieces with stones that caught his flashlight beam and threw back colored fire. Rubies, emeralds, diamonds, all set in gold filigree that spoke of master craftsmanship. There was more, so much more. Crates filled with paper currency, so old it was practically crumbling, but he could make out denominations: $100, $500, $1,000. In 1878, those were fortunes. There were ledgers, bound in leather, filled with columns of numbers and names, written in fading ink. There were maps, drawn on vellum, showing locations Marcus didn't immediately recognize. There were documents in protective cases, legal papers, deeds, contracts, and in the very back of the chamber, in the largest niche, there were paintings, actual oil paintings in ornate frames, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them remarkably well. Marcus carefully unwrapped one and shined his light on it. A landscape, mountains, and valleys, rendered with skill and detail. The signature in the corner was illegible, but the style was distinctly 19th century American. Marcus's mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to estimate value, trying to understand. This wasn't just a forgotten stash. This was a treasure vault, a repository of wealth that had been hidden here for over 140 years. The gold alone had to be worth millions. The coins could be priceless if they were rare enough. The jewelry, the paintings, the documents, all of it added up to something beyond his wildest imagination. He thought about the crack in the mining claim, the notation about being sealed by Marshall's order. This wasn't a mine that had run out of ore. This was something else entirely. Someone had brought all this wealth up here, hidden it in this chamber, and then sealed it away. But why? And whose fortune was this? Marcus spent the next 3 hours cataloging what he could see, taking photographs, with his phone, making notes, trying to estimate quantities. He counted at least 50 crates of various sizes, and he'd only opened or examined a fraction of them. Some were still sealed tight, their contents unknown. Others were stacked in corners, covered with canvas that had somehow survived the decades relatively intact. He found himself drawn to one particular crate near the back wall. It was smaller than the others, made of darker wood, with brass corners and a lock that had long since rusted through. Marcus pried it open carefully, and inside found something unexpected: personal effects. A leather-bound journal, its pages brittle but intact. A pocket watch, gold with intricate engraving. A photograph in a tarnished silver frame, showing a stern-faced man with a thick mustache standing next to a woman in a Victorian dress. And a letter, sealed in wax, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Marcus's hands shook as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same as in the ledgers, precise and methodical. He read by flashlight, "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and my sins have finally caught up with me. My name is Wilhelm Schneider, and for 6 years I have lived as an outlaw, taking what was not mine, justified by grievances that now seem small and petty. The woman in the photograph was my wife, Emma. She died of fever in 1871, and her medical bills bankrupted me. The banks took everything. I swore revenge, and I took it. Again and again, from banks and stages and payrolls. But revenge is a poor salve for grief. I accumulated this fortune, thinking it would ease my pain, but I feel nothing but emptiness. If you have found this chamber, you have also found wealth beyond measure. I ask only one thing. Use it better than I did. Let it bring life, not death. Let it heal, not harm. I cannot undo what I have done, but perhaps you can make something good from the ruins of my wicked life. The letter was signed and dated July 14, 1878, 9 days before the newspaper accounts said he'd been killed. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his consciousness. This wasn't just stolen wealth. It was blood money, taken in anger and grief, hoarded in isolation, never enjoyed. Schneider had died knowing his treasure was worthless, that all his crimes had bought him nothing but an early grave. The math was staggering. If each gold bar weighed about 27 pounds, and there were hundreds of them based on what he could see in the opened crates, that was thousands of pounds of gold. At current prices, gold was worth about $1,900 per ounce. A 27-pound bar contained over 400 ounces. That was over $760,000 per bar. If there were 500 bars, that was $380 million in gold alone. And that was just the gold. The coins would be worth far more than their metal content because of their age and rarity. The jewelry had both material and artistic value. The paintings could be worth anything from thousands to millions, depending on the artists. Even the old currency, if it was rare, could be valuable to collectors. Marcus carefully examined one of the gold coins more closely. It was a $20 double eagle, dated 1876. He knew enough about numismatics to recognize that certain years and mint marks could make these coins extraordinarily valuable. A common double eagle, in good condition, might be worth $2,000. A rare one could fetch hundreds of thousands at auction. He'd seen news stories about collectors paying over $7 million for a single coin. He moved through the chamber more systematically now, documenting everything with photographs, making detailed notes about placement and condition. In one corner, he found crates filled with silver dollars, Morgan and trade dollars from the 1870s. There had to be thousands of them. Even at minimum value, that was hundreds of thousands of dollars. If any were rare dates or mint marks, the value could be astronomical. The jewelry deserved special attention. Marcus found pieces that looked like they belonged in museum displays. Diamond necklaces with stones the size of his thumbnail. Ruby bracelets that caught the light like frozen fire. Emerald rings set in intricate gold work. One piece in particular caught his eye. A brooch shaped like a bird, made entirely of what appeared to be black opals surrounded by small diamonds. He'd never seen anything like it. Marcus felt dizzy, lightheaded. He sat down on one of the intact crates, his flashlight illuminating the impossible wealth surrounding him. The man they mocked for living in an ice shack was sitting in the middle of what had to be one of the largest treasure finds in American history. But the exhilaration faded quickly, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Because this wealth came with questions, dangerous questions. Whose was it? How did it get here? Why was it hidden? And most importantly, what happened to the person or people who hid it? He thought again about the marshal's order to seal the mine. Had someone been killed here? Had this treasure been stolen? Was it the proceeds of some 1800s crime spree, buried and forgotten? Or was there a more innocent explanation? Some wealthy eccentric who'd hidden their fortune and died before they could retrieve it. What happens next will change everything Marcus thought he knew about survival, about worth, and about the fine line between salvation and destruction. The discovery beneath the ice shack will bring more than wealth. It will bring danger, doubt, and decisions no man should have to make alone. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like share, and subscribe for more. Marcus stood and moved to one of the ledgers he'd spotted earlier. He opened it, carefully, the leather binding cracking slightly. The pages inside were yellowed but legible. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the work of someone keeping careful accounts. He began to read, translating the faded ink by the light of his flashlight. The ledger was a record of deposits and acquisitions, dated from 1872 through 1878. Each entry listed a date, an item or amount, and a source. Some entries read, 20 bars, Denver Mint. Others, jewelry collection, estate sale, Virginia City. Still others, currency, railroad payroll, intercepted route. That last one made Marcus's blood run cold. Intercepted route. That was a polite way of saying, stolen. He flipped through more pages, finding similar entries. Stagecoach, Nevada line. Bank transfer, diverted. Mining company payroll, acquired. This wasn't a legitimate fortune. This was stolen wealth, accumulated over 6 years by someone who'd robbed stagecoaches, payrolls, banks, and private citizens. The chamber wasn't a vault, it was a hideout. And Wilhelm Schneider hadn't been a prospector. He'd been an outlaw. Marcus's hands shook as he continued reading. The entries became more detailed as he progressed through the ledger. Schneider had been meticulous, documenting not just what he'd taken, but from whom. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway, $6,000 in gold. The First National Bank of Helena, $22,000 in mixed currency and bonds. The Anaconda Mining Company, payroll of $14,000. Private citizens, 2 wealthy travelers on stagecoaches, their jewelry and cash confiscated at gunpoint. One entry chilled Marcus to his core. Newlywed couple, Virginia City stage. Gold wedding band, diamond engagement ring, $147 cash. She begged. I took it anyway. The stark honesty of that confession, the casual cruelty, made Marcus's stomach turn. The final entries in the ledger were from July of 1878. The writing grew more erratic, more hurried. The last entry read, "They're coming. Marshall has our location. Moving the collection tomorrow night. If I don't make it, let this stand as testament. I regret nothing but getting caught." The page after that was blank. Whatever happened next hadn't been recorded. Marcus closed the ledger and sat down again, his mind reeling. This explained the marshal's order to seal the mine. They'd caught Schneider, or killed him, and sealed the mine to prevent anyone from finding his ill-gotten gains. But why seal it instead of confiscating the treasure? That didn't make sense unless they hadn't found it. Unless the mine was too dangerous to enter, or unless Schneider had booby-trapped it somehow. He looked around the chamber again, this time with new eyes. Were there traps? Had Schneider rigged this place to collapse or flood, or kill anyone who entered? Marcus had been down here for hours, and nothing had happened. But that didn't mean he was safe. He examined the timber supports more carefully, looking for signs of deliberate weakening or hidden mechanisms. Nothing obvious. But that didn't mean much after 146 years. More importantly, what was he supposed to do with this information? This treasure was stolen. It didn't belong to him. It belonged to banks and mining companies and families who'd been robbed over 140 years ago. Most of those institutions no longer existed. Most of those families were long gone, their descendants scattered, probably unaware that their great-great-grandparents had been victims of Wilhelm Schneider. But legally, this was still stolen property. If Marcus reported it, it would be confiscated. The government would take it, or it would be tied up in legal battles for decades, while various parties fought over ownership. Marcus would get nothing except maybe a finder's fee, a tiny percentage, barely enough to buy a real house, let alone change his life. And the townspeople, the ones who'd mocked him for 3 years, would probably try to claim some of it. The treasure was found on land, within the Coldwater Ridge area. They'd argue it belonged to the community, that it should be used for public good, for schools and roads and municipal buildings. They'd probably even name something after themselves, while completely forgetting that Marcus was the one who'd found it. He felt a surge of bitter anger. They'd laughed at him, dismissed him, treated him like he was insane. And now, if he did the right thing, the legal thing, they'd benefit from his discovery, while he got nothing but a pat on the head and another reason for them to talk about him. But keeping it was impossible. You couldn't just find $270 million in stolen gold and quietly sell it. The moment he tried to move even a single bar, questions would be asked. Where did you get this? Do you have documentation? What's the provenance? He'd be arrested for theft or fraud or God knows what else. Marcus stayed in the chamber until his flashlight began to dim, warning him that the batteries were dying. He took one last look around, committing it all to memory, then climbed back up the rope to his shack. The storm had intensified while he'd been below, and snow was blowing in through gaps in his walls. He pulled up the rope and covered the opening with the broken floorboards as best he could, then collapsed into his sleeping bag. Sleep didn't come. His mind wouldn't stop racing. He kept seeing those gold bars, those coins, those ledgers documenting 6 years of theft. He kept thinking about Wilhelm Schneider, a man who'd stolen a fortune and died before he could enjoy it. Was Marcus any different? He'd thrown away his career, his reputation, his entire life. And for what? To be proven right about something nobody cared about anymore. This treasure could change everything. He could hire lawyers, real ones, who could navigate the legal complexities. He could fight for a finder's fee large enough to matter. He could prove to everyone that he wasn't crazy, that his life on this mountain had led to something extraordinary. Or he could keep quiet. He could seal the opening back up, pretend he'd never found it, and let the treasure stay buried for another 100 years. No complications, no legal battles, no risk. Just back to survival, back to isolation, back to being the crazy mountain man. Except now he'd know. He'd know he was sleeping on top of a fortune. He'd know that with every cold night, every meal of rabbit stew, every mocking comment from townspeople, he could change it all if he just made one phone call. That knowledge would eat him alive. By morning, Marcus had made a decision, or at least the beginning of one. He needed more information. He needed to know exactly what he'd found, and he needed to understand the legal implications before he did anything else. That meant research. Real research. Not just old mining claims and local legends. When the storm finally broke, 2 days later, Marcus made the trek down to town again. This time, he went to the library, such as it was. A small room in the back of the community center, with donated books and 2 ancient computers with dial-up internet that barely worked. He spent 6 hours there, searching for anything he could find about Wilhelm Schneider and the robberies of the 1870s. The information was scattered and incomplete, buried in old newspaper archives and historical society websites. But slowly, a picture emerged. Wilhelm Schneider had been part of a gang called the Thunder Mountain Boys, a group of outlaws who'd terrorized the Montana and Idaho territories from 1872 to 1878. They'd been responsible for dozens of robberies, several murders, and the theft of an estimated $500,000, an astronomical sum, for the time. In today's dollars, adjusted for inflation, that would be well over 15 million. But the actual items stolen, the gold, the rare coins, the jewelry, would be worth far more to collectors and museums. Most of the gang had been caught or killed by 1877. Schneider had been the last holdout, and he'd become something of a folk legend, the outlaw who disappeared into the mountains, with all the gang's accumulated wealth. The territorial marshal had pursued him for months, finally tracking him to the Coldwater Ridge area in July of 1878. According to newspaper accounts, there had been a shootout. Schneider had been killed. But when the marshal's men searched the area, they found no treasure, just an empty mine shaft that they sealed up, claiming it was too unstable to explore safely. Marcus sat back from the computer screen, his mind working. They'd sealed it because they couldn't find the treasure. Schneider must have hidden it somewhere in the mine before the final confrontation. The marshal probably suspected it was still down there, but couldn't risk sending men into an unstable shaft. So they'd sealed it, marked it as dangerous, and hoped that eventually someone would find it through legal channels. Except no one had. For 146 years, the Thunder Mountain Boys' treasure had remained hidden beneath the frozen Montana earth, until a disgraced geologist built a shack directly on top of it, and a winter storm cracked open the secret. Marcus printed out everything he could, spending his last few dollars on copies. He gathered the papers, shoved them into his worn backpack, and headed for the door. On his way out, he nearly collided with someone entering. He looked up and found himself face to face with Dale Pritchard, the mayor of Coldwater Ridge, a man who'd publicly blamed Marcus for Bridgemont pulling out of their mining operation. Well, Dale said, his tone dripping with condescension. If it isn't our resident mountain man, finally decided to join civilization for a day. Marcus bit back the response he wanted to give. Just doing some research. Dale glanced at the papers visible in Marcus's open backpack. Research? Into what? How to build a proper house? He laughed at his own joke. Into history, Marcus said carefully. Mining history, specifically. Dale's expression shifted, becoming more interested and more suspicious. Mining history? You're not still going on about that Bridgemont nonsense, are you? That company pulled out because the numbers didn't work, not because of your conspiracy theories. It wasn't a conspiracy, Marcus said, his voice tight. It was geology. But you're right. They pulled out. That's old news. So, why the interest in mining history? Marcus could have lied. Should have lied. But something in him, some perverse need to hint at the truth without revealing it, made him say, Did you know there were outlaws operating around here in the 1870s? The Thunder Mountain Boys. They hid a fortune somewhere in these mountains. Dale snorted. That old legend? My grandfather used to tell stories about buried treasure when I was a kid. It's nonsense. If there was any treasure, someone would have found it by now. Maybe, Marcus said. Or maybe people just weren't looking in the right places. He pushed past Dale and out into the cold afternoon air. Behind him, he could hear the mayor laughing, telling someone else about the crazy mountain man now searching for imaginary pirate treasure. Let him laugh, Marcus thought. Let them all laugh. Soon enough, they'd know the truth. But first, Marcus needed to figure out what that truth meant, and what he was going to do about it. Marcus's mistake was trusting anyone at all. 3 days after his encounter with Mayor Pritchard at the library, he woke to the sound of engines grinding up the mountain road. Not one vehicle, but several. He peered through the frost-crusted window of his shack and felt his stomach drop. 4 trucks, 2 bearing the logo of the local news station, 1 a county sheriff's vehicle, and the last a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed federal government or corporate lawyer. He should have known. Dale Pritchard had a big mouth and an even bigger sense of self-importance. The moment Marcus had mentioned the Thunder Mountain Boys and buried treasure, even casually, even as a deflection, the mayor's wheels had started turning. A man didn't stay in local politics for 23 years without learning how to sniff out opportunity. Marcus pulled on his boots and coat as the vehicles came to a stop about 50 yards from his shack. The distance was deliberate, he realized. They were treating this like a crime scene or a hazardous area, maintaining a perimeter. His land, his discovery, and they were already acting like it belonged to them. The first person out was Sheriff Tom Brennan, A decent enough man who'd never been particularly cruel to Marcus, but had never defended him either. He approached slowly, hands visible, the universal signal for, "I'm not here to cause trouble," though the 7 other people climbing out of the vehicles suggested otherwise. "Marcus," Tom called out, stopping about 20 feet away. "We need to talk." "About what?" Marcus stepped outside, letting the door of his shack swing shut behind him. The wind was bitter, cutting through his worn coat like it wasn't even there. "About what you found." Tom's expression was carefully neutral. "Dale says you've been researching old mining claims and outlaw treasure. Says you implied you might have found something." "I implied nothing. I mentioned historical facts. That's not a crime." "No, it's not." Tom shifted his weight. "But if you have found something of historical or monetary significance on your property, there are laws about that. Reporting requirements. Archaeological preservation statutes. Not to mention, if this is related to the Thunder Mountain Boys like Dale thinks, that's stolen property. Federal jurisdiction." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I haven't stolen anything. I've been living on my own land, minding my own business, same as I have for 3 years. One of the news reporters, a young woman with perfectly styled hair that somehow wasn't being destroyed by the mountain wind, raised her microphone. "Mr. Webb, can you confirm that you've discovered the lost treasure of the Thunder Mountain Boys gang? Our sources say it could be worth millions." "Your sources are gossips with overactive imaginations," Marcus snapped. But even as he said it, he could see the calculation in everyone's eyes. They wanted it to be true. They needed it to be true. A treasure discovery would put Coldwater Ridge on the map, bring in tourists, money, attention. And if Marcus got in the way of that, they'd bulldoze right over him. The man from the black SUV approached now, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. He was in his 50s, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Marcus's entire shack. "Mr. Webb, I'm Carson Mills, attorney for the Montana Historical Preservation Society. We have reason to believe you may have discovered artifacts of significant historical value. Under state law, you're required to report such findings within 72 hours. Have you done so?" Marcus said nothing. Anything he said now would be used against him, twisted, turned into evidence of wrongdoing or incompetence, or both. Carson smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Your silence is noted. I have a court order here, requiring you to allow a preliminary inspection of your property and any structures thereon. You can cooperate voluntarily, or the sheriff can enforce the order. Your choice." "Let me see the order," Marcus demanded. Carson handed over a sheaf of papers. Marcus read through them quickly, his heart sinking with every paragraph. The order was legitimate, signed by a judge in the county seat that morning. Someone had moved fast, very fast, pulling strings and calling in favors to get this approved in less than 72 hours. The kind of fast that required either significant political influence or the promise of significant financial reward. "This gives you access to inspect for artifacts and assess historical significance," Marcus said, looking up from the papers. "It doesn't give you the right to remove anything or claim ownership." "That's correct," Carson agreed. "For now, but if we do find artifacts of historical significance, there will be additional legal proceedings to determine proper custody and ownership. I assume you'll want legal representation for those proceedings." It was a threat disguised as helpful advice. Marcus didn't have money for a lawyer. Everyone standing here knew it. They were counting on it. "I want to be present for any inspection," Marcus said. "Of course," Carson gestured to the others. "Shall we?" The next hour was a nightmare. They trampled through his shack, poking at his meager possessions, taking photographs of everything. When they reached the covered opening in the floor, where Marcus had replaced the broken boards, Carson's eyes lit up like a predator spotting wounded prey. "What's under here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "My property," Marcus replied. "Private property, which we have a court order to inspect." Carson nodded to two men Marcus hadn't noticed before, both wearing coveralls and carrying equipment. Archaeological contractors, probably. They began removing the boards Marcus had so carefully replaced. Within minutes, they had the opening exposed again. One of the men shined a powerful LED light down into the chamber below, and Marcus heard the sharp intake of breath that meant they'd seen the reflection of gold. "Sheriff," Carson said quietly, "I'm going to need you to secure this site immediately. Mr. Webb, you're going to need to vacate the premises while we conduct a full investigation." "Vacate? This is my home. This is now an active archaeological site and potential crime scene involving stolen property," Carson countered. "You can't stay here. It would compromise the investigation. You can't just kick me out. I have rights." Sheriff Tom looked uncomfortable, but resolved. "Marcus, I'm sorry, but the court order is clear. If there are artifacts of historical significance, the site needs to be secured. You can stay in town while this gets sorted out. I'm sure someone will put you up." Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity. The town that had mocked him for 3 years was suddenly supposed to house him. The same people who'd called him crazy and blamed him for their lost mining jobs? "I'll stay in my truck," Marcus said coldly. "That's your choice," Tom replied. "But you need to gather your essential belongings and clear out now." Marcus had no choice. He packed a duffel bag with clothes, his sleeping bag, and the research papers he'd printed at the library, which he'd hidden under his mattress. As he worked, he could hear the contractors setting up equipment, preparing to descend into the chamber. His discovery, being stolen from him in real time under the guise of legal process and historical preservation. The news crew filmed everything. Marcus could see the reporter doing a stand-up segment with his shack in the background, no doubt spinning this into a dramatic story of hidden treasure and mysterious mountain men. By tonight, this would be on every news station in Montana. By tomorrow, it would be national news. And Marcus would be portrayed as either a lucky fool or a suspicious character trying to hide stolen goods, depending on which narrative served the media better. As he climbed into his old truck, one of the archaeological contractors emerged from the chamber. Marcus could see his face, even from 50 yards away, pale and shocked, eyes wide. The man grabbed Carson's arm and whispered urgently. Carson's expression transformed from professional smugness to barely contained excitement. They'd seen it. They knew what was down there. And now Marcus had lost any chance of controlling how this played out. He drove down the mountain slowly, his truck protesting every bump and turn. In his rearview mirror, he could see more vehicles arriving at his shack. Word was spreading fast. The vultures were circling. In town, Marcus parked behind Riley's general store, in a spot where he wouldn't be immediately visible from the street. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out his next move. He had no money for a lawyer, no political connections, no influence, just his knowledge of what lay beneath his property and a burning certainty that he was about to be robbed blind by people who'd wrap their theft in legal language and righteous claims about historical preservation. He was sitting in his truck, trying to generate warmth by running the engine for a few minutes at a time to conserve gas. When someone tapped on his window, Marcus jumped, reaching instinctively for the tire iron he kept under his seat. But when he looked up, he saw an old man, probably in his 80s, with a weathered face and kind eyes behind thick glasses. Marcus rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" "Depends," the old man said. "Are you Marcus Webb, the geologist who found Wilhelm Schneider's treasure?" Marcus tensed. "Who's asking?" "Name's Arthur Holloway. I'm a historian, retired professor from the university in Missoula. Used to specialize in frontier outlaws and territorial law enforcement. I've been researching the Thunder Mountain Boys for 40 years. He paused. I think we need to talk. Somewhere. Private. Marcus studied the old man's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motive. He saw only genuine interest and, surprisingly, what looked like concern. Why should I trust you? Because I'm probably the only person in this whole state who doesn't want to steal what you found, Arthur replied. I want to understand it. There's a difference. Also, because I know things about that treasure that nobody else does, things that might help you keep it from being taken. It was a gamble, but Marcus was out of options. Where? My cabin. It's about 10 miles north of here. Follow me. Arthur's cabin turned out to be a modest A-frame on the edge of the national forest, surrounded by pines and accessible only by a rutted dirt road that Marcus's truck barely managed. Inside, it was warm and cluttered with books, papers, maps, and artifacts. The walls were covered with photographs and documents related to various outlaw gangs from the 1800s. Arthur made coffee, real coffee from an expensive-looking machine that seemed incongruous with the rustic cabin, and they sat at a table covered with maps of Montana Territory, circa 1878. Tell me what you found, Arthur said simply. Marcus hesitated, then decided honesty was his only option. He described the chamber, the crates, the gold bars and coins, the jewelry, the ledgers, everything. Arthur listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Marcus finished, Arthur sat back and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly. You found it. After all these years, someone actually found it. I'd almost started to believe it was a legend. It's real, Marcus confirmed, but I'm about to lose it. They have a court order. They're cataloging everything right now. By tomorrow, the state will probably claim ownership, or some preservation society will tie it up in legal battles for the next 20 years. Maybe not, Arthur said. He stood and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. I told you, I've been researching this for 40 years. What I haven't told anyone, because I didn't have proof, is that I believe the Thunder Mountain Boys' treasure isn't actually stolen property. Not all of it, anyway. Marcus leaned forward. What do you mean? Arthur spread documents across the table. The official story is that Wilhelm Schneider and his gang robbed their way across Montana and Idaho from 1872 to 1878. And they did commit robberies. That's documented. But the amounts never added up. The reported thefts totaled maybe $500,000 in period money. Even accounting for successful robberies that went unreported, you're looking at perhaps $750,000 maximum. But the estimates of what Schneider hid, some sources claimed it was over $2 million. Where did the rest come from? Maybe the estimates were wrong, Marcus suggested. Or maybe there was another source. Arthur pulled out a brittle newspaper clipping, protected in a plastic sleeve. This is from the Helena Independent, August 1878, 1 month after Schneider was killed. It's an obituary for a man named Harrison Caldwell, described as a wealthy mine owner and investor. Says he died without heirs, and his estate couldn't be located. I don't see the connection. Look at this. Arthur laid out another document, a hand-drawn family tree. Harrison Caldwell, married in 1853. His wife was Emma Caldwell, née Schneider, Wilhelm Schneider's sister. Marcus's eyes widened. Schneider was related to a wealthy mine owner. Not just related. Harrison Caldwell was Wilhelm's brother-in-law, and according to my research, they were close. When Emma Schneider died in 1871, it devastated both men. Harrison had no children, no other family. Wilhelm was the closest thing to a brother he had. I believe Harrison knew he was dying and gave his fortune to Wilhelm, or at least told him where it was hidden. That's why the treasure is so much larger than the robberies could account for. Most of it was legitimate wealth, inherited or gifted. Marcus's mind raced. If that's true, if most of the treasure was legitimately Wilhelm's through inheritance, then it's not stolen property. It's unclaimed estate assets. Exactly. Which means the state can't simply confiscate it. There would need to be a proper estate settlement. And since Wilhelm died without heirs, and the property was found on your land, you would have a strong legal claim as the finder. You'd be entitled to keep it, minus estate taxes. But I'd need proof. Legal documents showing the inheritance or gift. Arthur smiled. Did you find any documents in that chamber? Legal papers, deeds, anything like that? Marcus thought back to the crates he'd examined. There were document cases. I didn't open most of them. I was too focused on the gold and coins. Those documents could be your salvation, Arthur said. If there's a will, or a deed transfer, or any legal evidence of Harrison Caldwell's relationship with Wilhelm Schneider, you might be able to prove legitimate ownership. But you need to get those documents before the state seizes everything. They've already taken over the site, Marcus said bitterly. I can't get back in. Not legally, no. Arthur's eyes twinkled. But I assume you know your own property pretty well? Any other way into that chamber? Marcus started to shake his head, then stopped. The chamber had been part of a mine. Mines didn't typically have just one entrance, especially not mines dug by outlaws who'd want an escape route. If there was another entrance, it would be hidden, camouflaged, probably collapsed or blocked, but it might still be accessible. I'd need to survey the area, Marcus said slowly. Look at the topography, the rock formations. If there's another entrance, it would be downslope from the main chamber, probably on the eastern face of the ridge, where the granite is more fractured. How long would it take you to find it? A day, maybe 2 if it exists at all, and if I'm not arrested for trespassing on my own property. Arthur stood and grabbed a coat from a hook by the door. Then we should start now, before they lock down the entire mountain. What happens next will turn this discovery into a desperate race against powerful people who believe they're entitled to wealth they didn't earn and didn't risk their lives to find. Marcus and his unlikely ally will face dangers that go beyond legal battles, because when hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake, some people are willing to do anything to claim their prize. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The eastern face of the ridge was treacherous even in summer. In January, with ice coating every rock and snow obscuring the terrain, it was potentially deadly. Marcus and Arthur approached carefully. Marcus leading the way with the confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years learning every inch of these mountains. If there's another entrance, Marcus explained, breathing hard from the climb, it would need to be below the main chamber for drainage. Water flows down, so any secondary shaft would be dug to channel water away from the treasure room. Otherwise, it would flood every spring. They found it 2 hours later, not by sight, but by sound. Marcus was resting against a boulder when he heard something that didn't belong, a hollowness to the wind, like air moving through a cavity. He pressed his ear to the rock face and heard it clearly. Echo, the distinctive sound of wind in an empty space. Here, he called to Arthur. There's something behind this. Together, they cleared away snow and debris, revealing what looked like a natural crack in the rock face. But when Marcus examined it more closely, he could see chisel marks, barely visible, where someone had widened a natural fissure into a passage. It was narrow, maybe 2 feet wide, and blocked by what looked like a deliberate rock fall. Someone collapsed this intentionally, Marcus said. Probably Schneider, sealing his escape route after he'd finished hiding the treasure. Can we get through? Marcus studied the blockage. Maybe. It'll take hours, and we'll need to be careful. If we collapse it further, we could seal it permanently, or worse, trigger a larger fall that could bury us. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, carefully removing rocks one at a time, testing the stability of the remaining pile before proceeding. It was grueling, dangerous work. Twice, minor rockfalls forced them to scramble back, and once Marcus nearly lost his footing on the ice-slicked slope. But slowly, painfully, they created an opening. By the time darkness fell, they had a gap barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Marcus shined his flashlight into the space beyond, and saw hewn rock walls descending into darkness. "This is it," he said. "This is the secondary entrance. Should we go in now?" Arthur asked, though his exhausted expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Too dangerous in the dark. We'll come back tomorrow, early, before anyone realizes what we're doing." Marcus covered the entrance with branches and loose rocks, camouflaging it as best he could. "If someone finds this before we can get back, we're done." They made their way back to Arthur's cabin in darkness, guided by flashlights and sheer determination. Marcus was exhausted, every muscle aching, but his mind was racing. If they could access the chamber through the secondary entrance, if they could retrieve those documents Arthur believed existed, they might have a fighting chance. But as they drove the last mile to the cabin, Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Headlights, multiple sets, coming up the road behind them. Fast. Too fast for the conditions, suggesting urgency or aggression, or both. "Company," Arthur muttered, pressing the accelerator. They reached the cabin seconds before the pursuing vehicles. Marcus grabbed his duffel bag and followed Arthur inside. Through the window, they watched 3 trucks pull up, blocking the driveway. The first man out was Dale Pritchard, followed by Carson Mills and several others Marcus didn't recognize. Large men, wearing jeans and work jackets, the kind of men you hired when you needed something done and didn't care about the legality. Dale pounded on the door. "Open up, Arthur. We know Marcus is in there." Arthur looked at Marcus. "My cabin. My rules. Stay quiet." He opened the door but blocked the entrance with his body. "Dale, Carson, this is private property. What do you want?" "We want Marcus Webb," Dale said, trying to see past Arthur into the cabin. "He's wanted for questioning regarding the archaeological site on his property. There's evidence he may have removed artifacts before we could catalog them." "That's a lie," Marcus called from inside. "I didn't take anything." "Then you won't mind coming down to the sheriff's office to make a statement," Carson said smoothly. "Unless you have something to hide." It was a trap, and not even a subtle one. They wanted Marcus in custody, away from the mountain, unable to interfere with whatever they were planning. Once they had him isolated, they could hold him for 72 hours without charging him, more than enough time to strip the chamber of every valuable item. "Marcus doesn't have to go anywhere," Arthur said firmly. "He hasn't been charged with a crime. You have no warrant. Get off my property." Dale's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Arthur. This is bigger than some academic curiosity. That treasure belongs to the people of Montana, to Coldwater Ridge. We're not going to let some crazy hermit and a senile old professor stand in the way of what's rightfully ours." "Rightfully yours." Arthur's voice rose. "You didn't find it. You didn't live on that mountain for 3 years, surviving on rabbits and determination. Marcus did. And if there's any justice in this world, he'll be the one who benefits from his discovery." One of the large men with Dale stepped forward menacingly. "Old man, you should..." "Should what?" Arthur cut him off. "I'm 84 years old. I've got a heart condition, diabetes, and probably 6 months to live according to my doctor. You think I'm scared of you?" He pulled a shotgun from behind the door, not aiming it at anyone, but making its presence unmistakable. "This cabin is legally mine. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave before I exercise my right to defend my property." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Carson put a hand on Dale's shoulder. "Let's go. We'll handle this through proper legal channels." But as they turned to leave, Dale looked back at the cabin, and Marcus saw something dangerous in his eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. These men had tasted the possibility of wealth, and they wouldn't stop until they'd claimed what they believed was theirs. After the trucks left, Arthur locked the door and set the shotgun aside. They'll be back, probably with the sheriff next time, maybe with federal agents if they can. Convince someone this is stolen property. Then we need to move faster, Marcus said. We go back to that secondary entrance tonight. Get those documents. Prove the treasure isn't stolen. In the dark? On that slope? We'll die. Maybe. But if we wait until morning, we might lose our chance entirely. Marcus looked at the old historian, seeing exhaustion and fear, but also determination. You said you've been researching this for 40 years. You want to see this through or not? Arthur was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, a grin that made him look decades younger. I didn't spend my whole life studying dead outlaws just to give up when the story finally gets interesting. Let's go find those documents. They gathered equipment, extra flashlights, rope, water, protein bars. Arthur added his old camera, explaining that if they found documentation, they needed photographs as proof in case the originals were seized. Marcus strapped on his climbing harness and filled his pockets with anything that might be useful in a tight space underground. The drive back to the eastern ridge was tense, both men watching for headlights, for any sign they were being followed. They parked a mile away and hiked in, moving as quietly as possible through the frozen forest. Every snap of a branch, every crunch of snow sounded impossibly loud. At the concealed entrance, they removed the camouflage and prepared to descend. Marcus went first, squeezing through the narrow gap they'd created. The passage beyond was tight, claustrophobic, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He had to turn sideways in places, scraping against rough stone, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he moved. Behind him, he could hear Arthur struggling, his breathing labored. For a moment, Marcus worried the old man wouldn't fit. But then Arthur squeezed through a particularly narrow section, and they were both in the passage, descending into the unknown. The secondary shaft dropped steeply, more of a slide than stairs. They had to move carefully, testing each foothold, knowing that a fall here could mean broken bones, or worse. The air grew colder as they descended, and Marcus could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, the passage leveled out. Marcus's flashlight beam caught something ahead, a wall, the end of the tunnel. But when he examined it more closely, he realized it wasn't a dead end. It was a door, a massive wooden door bound with iron, built directly into the rock face. What kind of outlaw builds a door like this? Arthur whispered, awe evident in his voice. The kind who's protecting something more valuable than gold, Marcus replied. He examined the door's surface, running his hands over the wood. It was thick, solid, preserved by the cool, dry air of the mine. And there, in the center, was a lock, an old-fashioned keyhole, large enough to fit an old-style skeleton key. Marcus's mind raced back to the chamber, to the crates and boxes he'd examined. Had there been a key? He tried to visualize everything he'd seen, and then it hit him. In the crate with Wilhelm Schneider's personal effects, with the journal and pocket watch and letter, there had been something else, something he'd barely glanced at, because it had seemed insignificant. A key, an old iron key on a leather cord. We need to get into the main chamber, Marcus said. There's a key in one of the crates. I saw it, but didn't realize what it was for. Then, we'll have to go through the main entrance, Arthur said, which means getting past whatever security they've set up. They retraced their steps up the secondary shaft, emerging into the night air, gasping and exhausted. The temperature had dropped further, well below zero, and their breath came in frozen clouds. They hiked back to Marcus's property, approaching from the north, staying in the tree line. What they saw made Marcus's heart sink. The area around his shack was lit up like a construction site, portable floodlights powered by a generator. 2 trailers had been set up as temporary offices, and there were people everywhere: contractors, security guards, someone who looked like a state archaeologist, all working through the night. "They're not wasting any time," Arthur observed. "They're probably planning to remove everything before anyone can establish legal ownership." Marcus watched the scene below, feeling helpless and furious. They were dismantling his discovery, piece by piece, treating it like state property instead of his find on his land. And there was nothing he could do to stop them. Or was there? "I have an idea," Marcus said slowly. "But you're going to think I'm crazy. I'm standing on a frozen mountain in the middle of the night with a man who lives in an ice shack, planning to break into a sealed outlaw hideout." Arthur replied. "Crazy is relative. What's your plan?" Marcus smiled grimly. "We're going to walk right in the front door." Marcus's plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. They would approach openly, with Arthur acting as his legal representative and historical consultant. The key was confidence, the appearance of having every right to be there, backed by Arthur's academic credentials and decades of research. They walked down from the tree line just after midnight, when the site was at its busiest. Guards noticed them immediately, but before anyone could stop them, Arthur called out in his most authoritative professor voice, "I need to speak with whoever's in charge of this excavation immediately. There are critical historical preservation issues that haven't been addressed." A woman emerged from one of the trailers, wearing a university jacket and looking exhausted. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, lead archaeologist." "Who are you?" "Professor Arthur Holloway, retired, University of Missoula. I've been researching the Thunder Mountain Boys for 40 years, and I have documentation that suggests this site may contain materials not related to the gang's criminal activities, materials that require different handling protocols under state and federal law." Dr. Chen's expression shifted from annoyance to interest. "What kind of materials?" "Estate documents from Harrison Caldwell, a legitimate mine owner who died in 1878. If those documents are in this chamber, and if they establish a legal inheritance to Wilhelm Schneider, then this entire site's legal status changes dramatically. You could be confiscating legally owned property, which would expose the state to massive liability." It was a bluff, but a well-informed one. Dr. Chen hesitated, clearly weighing the academic credibility Arthur brought against the mess it could create, if he was right. "Do you have proof of this claim?" "I have 40 years of research. I have family trees, newspaper articles, legal records from the territorial period. What I don't have yet is access to the primary source, documents that should be in that chamber. Documents that Mr. Webb saw but didn't examine closely before you seized his property." Dr. Chen looked at Marcus for the first time. "Your Webb? The property owner?" "Yes, ma'am. You should have reported this discovery immediately. You violated at least 3 different statutes by not notifying authorities." "I discovered it 4 days ago during a winter storm," Marcus said calmly. "I was planning to report it properly after I documented what I found and understood what I was dealing with. Instead, the mayor turned it into a media circus before I had a chance." "That's not." Dr. Chen started, then stopped. Her expression suggested she knew exactly how this had unfolded, that political pressure and greed had driven the rushed response, not proper archaeological protocol. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Let Professor Holloway and me examine the document cases in the chamber," Marcus said. "With you present, on camera if you want. If we find evidence that supports his theory about legitimate inheritance, then you need to pause this excavation until proper legal ownership is established. If we don't find anything, then you continue as planned, and I walk away." Dr. Chen considered this for a long moment. "This is highly irregular. So is conducting a major archaeological excavation in the middle of the night under political pressure instead of academic standards," Arthur countered. "I know you didn't want to rush this. I can see it on your face. Someone's pushing you to move fast before proper legal challenges can be filed. But if you seize property that turns out to be legitimately owned, your career is over. The university will disavow you to protect itself from liability. That struck home. Dr. Chen's jaw tightened, and Marcus could see her making calculations. Finally, she nodded. 1 hour. You can examine the document cases we haven't opened yet. I'll be present, along with 2 of my team members. Everything will be photographed and documented. If you try to remove anything, you'll be arrested immediately. Understood? Understood, Marcus and Arthur said in unison. They descended into the chamber through the main entrance, now equipped with proper lighting and safety equipment. The transformation was jarring. What had been Marcus's secret discovery, his moment of wonder in the darkness, was now a well-lit work site, with numbered tags on every crate, detailed photographs on clipboards, and the sterile efficiency of professional archaeology. But the wonder was still there. Even Dr. Chen, who'd presumably seen her share of significant finds, moved through the space with barely concealed awe. The sheer quantity of gold and treasure was staggering, worth far more than anyone had initially estimated. Marcus overheard 2 of the contractors whispering about values exceeding $400 million once they'd begun a proper count. 400 million. The number was so large it had stopped meaning anything to Marcus. It was just an abstraction, a figure that existed in some realm beyond his comprehension. Dr. Chen led them to a corner where several document cases remained sealed. They were leather-bound cases with brass locks, the kind wealthy people used in the 19th century to protect important papers. These haven't been opened yet, she explained. We were waiting for a documents specialist to arrive from Billings. May I? Arthur asked, pulling on white cotton gloves Dr. Chen provided. She nodded, and Arthur carefully opened the first case. Inside were deeds, contracts, business papers, all related to mining operations. Arthur photographed each one with his camera, hands remarkably steady for someone his age. Most were routine, claims filed and abandoned, standard business of the frontier. The second case held personal correspondence. Letters between Wilhelm Schneider and his sister Emma, dating back to the 1850s. Arthur read through them, quickly, his eyes scanning for anything relevant. Then he stopped, his breath catching audibly. What? Dr. Chen leaned in. Arthur held up a letter dated April 12, 1878. Listen to this. It's from Harrison Caldwell to Wilhelm Schneider. Brother, the doctor says, I have weeks, perhaps days. I have no children to inherit what I've built, and Emma's death still grieves me beyond words. You are the only family I have left. I want you to have everything, my mines, my investments, my savings, all of it. I know you've made mistakes since Emma passed, and I pray you'll find redemption. But regardless of your past, you're my brother in all but blood, and what's mine should be yours. My lawyer has drawn up the papers. Everything is legal and proper. When I'm gone, you'll be a wealthy man. Use it well. The silence in the chamber was profound. Dr. Chen took the letter carefully, examining it under her flashlight. If this is authentic, there should be legal papers, Arthur said, already opening the third case. The will, the transfer documents, something official. And there were. The third case contained Harrison Caldwell's last will and testament, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving his entire estate to Wilhelm Schneider. There were property deeds signed over, stock certificates transferred, bank account authorizations, everything done legally and correctly. Arthur looked up at Dr. Chen, his eyes shining with vindication. This treasure isn't stolen. Most of it, anyway. The gold bars with the 1874 dates, the legitimate currency, the mining stock certificates, all of it came from Harrison Caldwell's legal fortune. Yes, Schneider added to it with his robberies over the next few years, But the bulk of this wealth was legitimately his through inheritance. Dr. Chen sat down on one of the intact crates, looking stunned. This changes everything. The legal status, the ownership claims, all of it. It means the state can't simply confiscate it as stolen property, Marcus said quietly. It means this is an estate settlement issue, not a criminal matter. It means you might actually have a legal claim to this, Dr. Chen said to Marcus, though she didn't sound happy about it. As the finder on your own property, if the original owner died without heirs and the estate was never properly settled. She trailed off, shaking her head. You'll need lawyers, good ones. This is going to be complicated. But possible, Marcus asked. Possible, she admitted. Though the state will fight you. The governor's office is already planning how to spend this money, talking about schools and infrastructure. They're not going to give it up easily. The legal battle that followed lasted 8 months. It became the biggest news story in Montana, drawing national attention and turning Marcus into an unwilling celebrity. The man who'd lived in an ice shack, mocked and dismissed, was suddenly on television, in newspapers, analyzed by legal experts and treasure enthusiasts across the country. The state argued that regardless of inheritance, Wilhelm Schneider had been a known criminal, and his estate should be forfeit. Marcus's lawyers, a team assembled by Arthur using his academic connections and working partially pro bono, because the case was too fascinating to pass up, argued that Schneider had never been convicted in a court of law, only killed by law enforcement. Without a conviction, there could be no legal forfeiture of his estate. The families of some of Schneider's robbery victims came forward, claiming portions of the treasure. Marcus's legal team didn't fight these claims. They acknowledged that the gold bars, dated after Harrison Caldwell's death, roughly 30% of the total value, were likely from robberies and should be returned to victims' estates where ownership could be proven. This decision, made by Marcus over the objections of some of his lawyers, changed the narrative. Suddenly, he wasn't a treasure hunter trying to keep stolen gold. He was a man trying to do the right thing, willing to give up millions to ensure justice for century-old wrongs. The judge's final ruling, delivered on a cold September morning, split the treasure according to a complex formula. 30% would go to proven victims' estates. 20% would go to the state as taxes and archaeological preservation costs. The remaining 50% would be divided between Marcus as finder and the newly established Caldwell-Schneider Historical Trust, which Marcus himself had proposed creating. When the dust settled and everything was calculated, Marcus's share came to approximately $63 million. $63 million. The number was still incomprehensible. Marcus sat in Arthur's cabin the day after the ruling, staring at the legal documents that made him, on paper at least, a very wealthy man. Arthur poured coffee, the old professor's hands shaking, slightly, not from age, but from shared exhaustion and relief. "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked. Marcus had been thinking about nothing else for months. "I'm going to build something that matters." The transformation of Coldwater Ridge began quietly, but accelerated quickly. Marcus bought his shack property and the surrounding 50 acres from himself, essentially, through a complex legal transaction that established clear ownership and cleared any remaining disputes. Then he bought adjacent land, expanding to nearly 200 acres of mountain territory. On that land, he built not just a museum, but a center for learning and discovery. The Caldwell-Schneider Heritage Center opened 2 years after the treasure's discovery, a beautiful facility built into the mountainside, using sustainable materials and modern design that somehow felt like it belonged in the wilderness. The center's main hall displayed the treasure, not all of it, but representative pieces, gold bars behind, armored glass, rare coins in climate-controlled cases with detailed placards explaining their history. The jewelry, stunning in museum lighting, arranged like art. The paintings, properly restored and hung in a gallery that would have made any big city museum envious. But the center was more than just a display of wealth. It told the complete story, Wilhelm Schneider's crimes, documented honestly, with information about the victims and their families. Harrison Caldwell's life as a legitimate businessman and grieving husband. The territorial period's lawlessness and the people who survived it. The geology of the mountain and how the mine was constructed. The modern discovery and the legal battles that followed. And it told Marcus's story too, though he'd resisted that part. A small exhibit showed his ice shack, preserved and relocated to the center grounds. It explained how a disgraced geologist had spent 3 years living in isolation, how he'd discovered the treasure by accident, how he'd fought to ensure it was handled ethically. The mockery had turned to respect, though Marcus found that almost as uncomfortable as the original contempt. The townspeople who'd laughed at him now wanted to shake his hand, to tell him they'd always believed in him, to rewrite their memories, to cast themselves in a better light. He accepted their praise with quiet grace, not because he'd forgiven them, but because anger was exhausting and he had better things to do with his energy. The center employed 43 people from Coldwater Ridge and surrounding communities, museum staff, tour guides, security, maintenance, administrative positions. Marcus paid well, better than anyone in the area, and offered benefits that included education stipends. Several of the teenagers who'd once dared each other to approach the crazy mountain man now worked as junior guides, telling visitors about the treasure with genuine enthusiasm. Marcus funded scholarships at the community college in Billings, specifically for students studying geology, history, or archaeology. He established a grant program for small businesses in Coldwater Ridge, helping the town diversify its economy beyond just the museum. Tourism. He donated to the school district, not for a building with his name on it, but for teacher salaries and classroom supplies, the kind of basic support that actually helped kids learn. And he kept his ice shack, or at least a version of it, on the museum grounds. Visitors could see where he'd lived, could understand the isolation and determination that had defined those 3 years. Inside, preserved behind glass, was his wood stove, his sleeping bag, his tools, the meager possessions of a man who'd lost everything and somehow found something greater. But Marcus didn't live there anymore. He'd built a modest home on the property, a comfortable cabin with running water and heat, and all the modern conveniences he'd gone without for so long. It was nice, but not ostentatious. He didn't need a mansion. He'd learned during those 3 years in the ice shack that happiness wasn't about square footage or luxury fixtures. It was about purpose, about meaning, about knowing you'd done something that mattered. Arthur Holloway became the center's chief historian and Marcus's closest friend. The old professor, given access to the documents and artifacts he'd spent 40 years researching, produced a definitive academic book on the Thunder Mountain Boys that won several prestigious awards. He donated all his royalties to the center's educational programs, saying he'd already received his payment in the form of answered questions and solved mysteries. On the center's 2nd anniversary, they held a special event. Families of Schneider's robbery victims, who'd received portions of the treasure, came to see where it had been hidden. Some were angry, still, about ancestors who'd been wronged. Others were philosophical, acknowledging that history was complicated, and that bringing some good from old evil was perhaps the best resolution possible. Mayor Dale Pritchard attended, because of course he did, giving a speech about Coldwater Ridge's bright future and the importance of historical preservation. He never acknowledged his role in trying to steal the discovery from Marcus, never apologized for the years of mockery and blame. Marcus didn't expect him to. Some people never learned, never grew, never saw past their own self-interest. But others did. Sheriff Tom Brennan, who'd enforced the court order that had kicked Marcus out of his shack, pulled him aside during the anniversary reception. "I owe you an apology," Tom said quietly. "I should have stood up for you, should have questioned that court order more carefully. I let politics and pressure override what was right." Marcus shook his hand. "You were doing your job. I was doing what was easy," Tom corrected. "There's a difference. You taught me that. You did the hard thing, the right thing, when everyone was telling you to do the opposite. That takes real courage." The story of the ice shack and the treasure spread far beyond Montana. Marcus received letters from around the world, from people who'd been mocked or dismissed, or told they were crazy for pursuing their convictions. They wrote to say his story had inspired them to keep going, to trust themselves, to believe that vindication sometimes came in unexpected forms. One letter, from a single mother in Ohio who was fighting to expose corporate pollution in her community, moved Marcus to tears. She wrote, "Everyone thinks I'm paranoid. My own family tells me to give up. But I saw your story, and I realized that sometimes the people who seem crazy are the only ones seeing clearly. Thank you for showing me that standing alone doesn't mean standing wrong." Marcus framed that letter and hung it in his office at the center. It reminded him why he'd fought so hard. Not just for the treasure, but for the principle. For the idea that truth mattered more than convenience. That integrity couldn't be bought. That one person's courage could change the world in ways both large and small. 3 years after finding the treasure, Marcus stood on the deck of his cabin and looked down at the Heritage Center, glowing in the evening light. Visitors still walked the grounds, families taking photos, children pressing their faces against the display cases to see the gold coins up close. The parking lot was full, the gift shop doing steady business, the whole operation humming with life and purpose. He thought about the man he'd been, the geologist who'd lost everything trying to do the right thing. He thought about the 3 years in the ice shack, the cold and hunger and loneliness, the constant mockery, the certainty that he'd thrown his life away for nothing. He thought about the winter storm that had cracked open the earth and revealed secrets buried for a century and a half. And he realized something profound. The treasure hadn't saved him. He'd already saved himself. Through those 3 years of refusing to give up, refusing to leave, refusing to believe that the world's judgment was the final word on his worth. The treasure had just revealed what was already there. A man of integrity, courage, and unshakable determination. Arthur joined him on the deck, moving slower these days, but still sharp as ever. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever regret it?" Arthur asked. "The career you lost, the years in that shack, everything you gave up?" Marcus thought about it honestly. "No," he said finally. "I thought I was giving up everything. Turns out, I was just clearing space for something better, something real." "The treasure?" "The purpose," Marcus corrected. "The treasure was just money. Purpose is what you do with it." Arthur smiled. "You've become quite philosophical for a geologist. Mountains will teach you things if you listen long enough," Marcus replied. "Patience, perspective, the understanding that what looks like an ending might just be a beginning you're too close to see." The man they'd called crazy, the hermit they'd mocked, the fool they'd pitied, had become something none of them expected. Not a wealthy recluse hoarding his fortune, not a bitter victim seeking revenge, but a builder, a teacher, a man who'd turned personal vindication into community transformation. The ice shack remained on the grounds, preserved and protected, a reminder of where he'd come from. But it wasn't a monument to suffering. It was a testament to resilience, to the strength found in isolation, to the treasures that sometimes lie beneath the frozen ground of our worst moments. Marcus Webb had discovered $270 million in gold and artifacts beneath his home. But what he'd really discovered was something worth far more. Proof that integrity couldn't be stolen, that truth eventually prevailed, and that sometimes the people the world dismisses as crazy are the only ones sane enough to see what really matters. Anyone can survive mockery if they're stubborn enough to know their own worth and brave enough to wait for the world to catch up. As the last light faded from the Montana sky, Marcus turned from the deck and went inside, not to count his fortune or admire his success, but to plan the next day's work. Because the treasure had taught him one final lesson. Wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to build something larger than yourself, something that would outlast you, something that proved a life was measured, not by what you accumulated, but by what you gave away and what you left behind. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories of courage, discovery, and transformation. Click to explore with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the places everyone else stopped looking.